Hi everybody, in this video I just want to briefly introduce and explain blocks that work with any component of the same type. So far we've been just reproducing the same button over and over again, for example, or the same sprite if you need multiple copies of the same image sprite, things like that. You'll see you end up having like a list of button 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this case, I think we had like 9 buttons that were the same thing. And there's actually a solution where you don't have to copy that. I wanted you to see that you can just have a bunch of code that is the same, and that sometimes that is in fact fine. Like it's okay to just copy something. Eventually, it starts to get to be tedious, and there's too much code, and you might just want to condense it down. And it's okay to do that if, to save space and if the organization makes sense. So for example, you instead of all 9 of these different buttons that have the same function, you could use any component down here underneath all these. See, these are all for specific components, like specific buttons. But there's another type of block set for like any button or any label or any table arrangement. So I'm going to click any button, and now you can see all these things don't say a specific button. They say when any button is clicked or when any button something happens to it, and you can set, this is sort of it generally applies to buttons. Now the reason I didn't introduce this at first is it does sometimes add some extra complications. Like sometimes you have to later specify which component you want to use, or you have to get the component from this component block. So there is a little bit of extra complication, but let me just show you one case of how this works and how you solve the complication. So I'll get my actually I think I already have an example of this, so I'm going to put this away. So put that away. That's what it looks like. It's when any button click, and then here's my example. When any button is clicked, here's the thing. All I want it to really do is for most buttons, do this. Right? Think about what these do. I want to check and see if it's empty. If it is empty, set the text to whoever's turn it is. Call next turn. Else, update the text that says this square is taken, and call the check for winner procedure. Okay. Well, that's all pretty much right here. That's what all this is, but there's this kind of this extra layer of complication where you have to say which button you're talking about anyway. Like you don't have to duplicate this like 9 times, but you do have to say which button you're talking about. So for example, if is empty, you have to figure out which button. So button.text of component get component. So where do you get the current component from? It's attached to this button click. So when any button is clicked, it provides the component name of the button that was clicked. You're not going to know. There are 9 of them. It could be any one of them. Is it button 1? Is it button 2? I don't know, but this thing knows. So when it's clicked, that button tells this block what button it was that got clicked. So this get component thing is what's going to tell all this code which button you're actually talking about. So that's the solution to this extra bit of complication. You get all of these extra, button.text, set button.text, that kind of thing. Again, from the any button. You don't get a specific button, you get an any button. Any button.text or any button's set button.text. You notice it doesn't say button 1 here, it doesn't say button 2 here, it just says button. So you have to specify later using that get component thing. But then, the logic of all of it is exactly the same. So if that button is empty, just like before, set that button's text property for that specific button, that get component, that specific component is the button. to whatever X or O is in the global turn. Call next turn. And the label.text thing for when it's taken is actually the same, and then you check for a winner. One other catch that you have to worry about is what about other buttons that have nothing to do with all this? Because there is, at least in this case, one other button that has nothing to do with the function that those 9 tic-tac-toe grid buttons do. Those 9 squares. Button new. That's for when you create a new game. So in that case, you have to have an if statement, an extra if statement on the outside of this if statement. If the clicked component happens to not be button new, that's when you do all this stuff. So only applies if it's not button new. Button new does its own thing. Remember, that's when you want to create a new game. So, pick a random X or O, set all these buttons to blank. Probably could replace this with an any button as well, except you have to have another if statement to catch button new because you don't want to blank out button new. So again, like, having a general solution is sometimes really nice because you have one thing that handles all of it instead of 9 things. On the other hand, sometimes having 9 things is just simple. Like, I just did this 9 times. I don't really feel any need to go back and update this with if statements to check to see, which button is being replaced with blank and which one isn't. I don't need to. This works fine. So, there's 2 examples of situations where maybe you might want to just condense everything down into a general solution for any component. In a situation where, it's only one block for each one, it's not a huge deal. Just leave it as a bunch of separate blocks. So there's an example of how to use blocks that work with any component. You might find that useful moving forward.